Number 1. Jodi Arias. She showed up to his memorial service with a smile, brought a card for his grieving family, and even offered to help police find his killer, all while knowing she was the one who had stabbed him 27 times, slashed his throat, and shot him in the head. Jodi Ann Arias was born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California. She dropped out of high school but earned her GED, drifting through waitressing and photography jobs. By her mid-20s, she'd converted to Mormonism and joined the motivational speaking circuit for prepaid legal. At a Las Vegas conference in September 2006, she met Travis Victor Alexander, a 30-year-old motivational speaker from Mesa, Arizona. Travis was charismatic, successful, and devout. The attraction was immediate but complicated. Travis wanted to maintain his church's strict standards on physical intimacy, yet their relationship quickly became sexual, creating guilt and conflict that persisted throughout. The relationship was turbulent from the start. Jodi moved to Mesa in 2007 to be closer to Travis, reorganizing her entire life around him. But Travis struggled constantly, torn between attraction and religious conviction. By summer 2007, he'd officially ended things, though they continued an on and off pattern involving sexual encounters, mixed with Travis dating other women. Jodi moved back to California but couldn't let go. She hacked his Facebook and email accounts, called obsessively, and appeared uninvited at his home. By early 2008, Travis was dating other Mormon women seriously, telling friends he wanted marriage and family. He confided to multiple people that he feared Jodi, that someone was entering his home and accessing his computer. He changed passwords, installed new locks, and grew increasingly paranoid. On June 4, 2008, roommates discovered Travis's body in his bathroom shower. He'd been dead for 5 days. The scene was horrific. 27 stab wounds, his throat slashed nearly to the point of decapitation, and a gunshot to his temple. Blood covered the bathroom with drag marks showing his desperate fight for life. A camera in the washing machine contained deleted photos showing Travis alive in the shower around 5:30 p.m., then accidental images during a struggle. The ceiling, Travis bleeding on the floor, and most damning, Jodi's leg as she dragged something across the hallway. The timestamps proved she was present during the murder. When police contacted Jodi in Eureka, California, she claimed she hadn't been in Arizona. Investigators quickly dismantled her story. She'd rented a car far from home in Redding, purchased 3 gas cans to avoid credit card trails near Mesa, and turned off her cell phone before entering Arizona. She arrived in Utah with cuts on her hands. As evidence mounted, Jodi changed her story, claiming masked intruders had attacked Travis while she watched helplessly. Investigators found this absurd. The gun matched one stolen from her grandparents' home 1 week before, and the knives matched weapons from Travis's kitchen. In July 2008, Jodi was arrested for first-degree murder. By her January 2013 trial, she'd changed her story again, now claiming self-defense, alleging Travis had been abusive, and attacked her after she dropped his camera. The trial became a media sensation, broadcast live. Jodi testified for 18 days, painting Travis as abusive. Prosecutors destroyed her credibility, presenting her journal with 0 mentions of abuse, only loving entries. Witnesses testified Travis had feared Jodi's stalking. The premeditation evidence was overwhelming: the stolen gun, the rental car designed to avoid detection, the gas cans, the turned-off phone. The medical examiner testified that defensive wounds on Travis's hands proved he'd fought desperately for his life against a sustained attack. On May 8, 2013, the jury found Jodi guilty of first-degree murder with especially cruel circumstances. 2 juries deadlocked on the death penalty. On April 13, 2015, Judge Sherry Stevens sentenced her to life without parole. Jodi is currently at Arizona State Prison Complex in Goodyear. She's filed multiple appeals, all denied, and maintains she acted in self-defense despite overwhelming evidence. The case spawned countless documentaries and became a cultural touchstone about obsession and toxic relationships, raising questions about what drives someone to commit such brutal violence against a person they claim to love. But while Jodi Arias couldn't accept that her relationship was over, a woman in Houston was about to show that some people respond to marital problems with violence so extreme that even veteran homicide detectives would struggle to comprehend the sheer brutality of what one person could inflict on another. Number 2. Susan Wright. To their Houston neighbors, the Wrights seemed like an ordinary young couple navigating marriage and parenthood, until January 2003, when investigators counting stab wounds on Jeff Wright's bound body had to continue all the way to 193. Susan Lucille Weish was born in Houston, Texas in 1976, growing up in working-class neighborhoods marked by instability and difficulty. Her childhood was troubled, and by her late teens, she was working as a waitress to support herself. It was in this capacity that she met Jeffrey Andrew Wright, a salesman for a tobacco company who was outgoing, charming, and seemed to offer the stability she'd been desperately seeking. They married quickly, perhaps too quickly, and by their early 20s had 2 young children, a son born in 1997 and a daughter in 2000. From the outside looking in, they appeared to be building a conventional suburban life in their Harris County home. But friends and family knew their relationship was marked by fierce arguments about money, Jeff's drinking habits, and mutual accusations of infidelity that created constant tension. Jeff Wright worked long hours and traveled frequently for his tobacco sales job, which Susan later claimed fueled her growing suspicions about other women. Friends described him as sometimes controlling and volatile, particularly after drinking, though none reported witnessing actual physical violence between the couple. Susan, meanwhile, felt increasingly isolated and trapped, stuck at home with 2 small children under the age of 5 while managing mounting household debt. The couple argued constantly and loudly about Jeff's spending habits. He liked to maintain appearances of success even when money was tight, and about Susan's frustrations with being left alone to handle all childcare and household responsibilities. By late 2002, their marriage had deteriorated to the point where divorce seemed inevitable, though neither had taken formal legal steps to end it. The night of January 13, 2003, would become the subject of intense legal debate and conflicting narratives. According to Susan's later testimony at trial, Jeff came home intoxicated and angry. An argument escalated quickly, and he became physically violent toward her. She claimed he'd hit her on previous occasions, though she'd never reported any domestic violence to police or sought medical treatment for injuries. She would tell the court that on this particular night, she genuinely feared for her life and believed she had to fight back to survive. What happened next, however, went far beyond any reasonable legal definition of self-defense and entered the realm of sustained, methodical, rage-filled killing. At some point during their confrontation, Susan Wright managed to secure her husband to their marital bed, using neckties as restraints. She tied his wrists and ankles tightly to the bedposts, rendering him completely helpless and unable to defend himself or escape. Then she walked to the kitchen, retrieved 2 knives, returned to the bedroom, and began stabbing him. The attack was relentless and prolonged, lasting a significant period of time. Jeff Wright suffered 193 stab wounds, covering nearly every inch of his body: his chest, back, abdomen, neck, face, arms, and legs. The medical examiner would later testify that many of these wounds were inflicted while Jeff was still fully conscious and aware, and that he would have suffered tremendously before finally dying from massive blood loss and trauma. The sheer number of wounds indicated the attack took considerable time to complete, giving Susan multiple opportunities to stop, yet she continued stabbing long after Jeff could have posed any conceivable threat to her safety. The aftermath of the murder revealed cold calculation and deliberate planning. Susan wrapped Jeff's body in a blue plastic tarp and dragged it through the house and out to the backyard, leaving a trail that investigators would later discover. She buried him in a shallow grave beneath an ornamental fountain she'd recently had installed in the yard, the dirt still soft, enough to accommodate his body. She then cleaned the bedroom meticulously, scrubbing away blood evidence and even repainting the walls to hide any remaining signs of the violence. Then she began constructing an elaborate lie. She told Jeff's parents, her own family, friends, neighbors, and anyone who asked that Jeff had simply abandoned them. Prinwooden that he'd walked out one day without warning, leaving her and the children behind. She accessed his bank accounts, used his credit cards to make purchases, and for nearly 4 days maintained the fiction that he'd disappeared voluntarily. But Jeff's parents, Kay and Ron Wright, knew their son would never abandon his children under any circumstances. When Jeff failed to show up for their grandson's 4th birthday party on January 16th, something he would never have missed, they became seriously alarmed. and immediately contacted authorities. Detectives interviewed Susan on January 17th, and her story began falling apart rapidly under questioning. She couldn't explain why Jeff would leave without taking clothes, without his car, without making any ATM withdrawals or credit card purchases after January 13th. Her account of their last argument kept changing in small but significant ways with each retelling. When investigators obtained a search warrant for the Wright home, they immediately noticed strong, fresh paint smell in the bedroom and recently disturbed earth in the backyard where the fountain had been installed. Confronted with these physical inconsistencies and facing the certainty that forensic testing would reveal the truth, Susan eventually admitted that Jeff was buried in the backyard. She led police directly to his body and was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Susan's defense team built their entire strategy around battered woman syndrome. They argued that Susan had suffered years of unreported physical and emotional abuse at Jeff's hands, that she'd been systematically isolated and controlled, and that on January 13th, she genuinely feared for her life when she fought back. They presented testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen bruises on Susan at various times and heard Jeff make threatening statements. They argued that her actions, while undeniably extreme, were the desperate response of a terrorized woman who saw no other escape from a dangerous marriage. The prosecution, however, emphasized the nature and number of the stab wounds. Lead prosecutor Kelly Siegler famously brought the actual bed from the crime scene into the courtroom and lay on it herself, demonstrating to the jury how completely helpless and defenseless Jeff would have been while tied down and restrained. She argued powerfully that a man restrained to a bed simply cannot pose a threat to anyone, that Susan had ample time to leave the house or call for help once Jeff was secured, and that the 193 stab wounds proved this was murder driven by pure rage and hatred, not self-defense or fear. The prosecution also highlighted Susan's calculated behavior after the murder, the careful disposal of the body, the systematic lies to everyone, and her attempts to financially benefit from Jeff's death. The trial, held in 2004, attracted significant media attention and became known nationally as the Blue-Eyed Butcher case. After hearing all evidence, the jury rejected the self-defense claim and found Susan Wright guilty of murder. However, in what some observers saw as a compromise verdict that acknowledged some credibility to the abuse allegations, she received a sentence of 25 years rather than the life sentence prosecutors had sought. Under Texas law at that time, she would be eligible for parole after serving half her sentence with good behavior. Susan Wright was incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where she became a model prisoner, participating in rehabilitation programs and maintaining exemplary behavior. In December 2020, after serving 16 years, she was granted parole over the strong objections of Jeff's family. They argued that the sentence had already been far too lenient for such a brutal crime, and that Susan had never shown genuine remorse or taken full responsibility for the extreme violence of her actions. Today, Susan Wright lives in Texas under strict parole supervision, prohibited from profiting from her story. Her 2 children, who were very young when their father was murdered, are now adults carrying the psychological burden of knowing their mother killed their father. But if Susan Wright's violence was unleashed in a single night of rage, another woman in California was nurturing resentment over years that would eventually explode into double murder. Number 3, Betty Broderick. She worked multiple jobs to put her husband through medical and law school, raise their 4 children, and help build a fortune in San Diego's wealthiest neighborhoods. Then she walked into his bedroom with a revolver and made sure he'd never enjoy any of it with anyone else. Elizabeth Ann Bisceglia was born on November 7, 1947, in Eastchester, New York, the third of 6 children in a devout Catholic family. She was bright, vivacious, and popular, the kind of young woman who seemed destined for a traditional but comfortable middle-class life. She met Daniel Thomas Broderick III at a college party in 1965 when both were students. Dan was ambitious, charismatic, and determined to become either a doctor or a lawyer, someone clearly headed for professional greatness. They married on April 12, 1969, when Betty was just 21 years old, and she immediately dedicated herself completely to making his dreams possible. For the next decade, she would work multiple jobs simultaneously, as a teacher, as a receptionist, doing whatever it took to support Dan financially through Cornell Medical School, then through Harvard Law School. She managed their household through multiple relocations from New York to Massachusetts to California, raised their growing family, and postponed any personal ambitions or dreams of her own to serve his career advancement. Dan Broderick's career flourished beyond their wildest expectations. He completed both his medical degree and his law degree, then specialized in medical malpractice law in San Diego, where his exceptional intelligence and courtroom skills made him phenomenally successful. By the early 1980s, he was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, with his income eventually reaching into the millions. The family moved into increasingly lavish homes in San Diego's most exclusive neighborhoods, like La Jolla. They had 4 children, belonged to prestigious country clubs, drove luxury cars, and from every outside appearance were living the American dream that Betty had worked so incredibly hard to make possible through her years of sacrifice. But by the mid-1980s, cracks in the marriage were becoming impossible to ignore. Dan was working extremely long hours, traveling frequently for cases, and spending more and more time at his law office. Betty noticed he was emotionally distant, increasingly distracted, and growing more critical of her appearance and behavior. She began to suspect something was seriously wrong. In 1983, Dan hired a new legal assistant named Linda Kolkana, a former airline stewardess who was 28 years old, beautiful, charming, and more than a decade younger than Betty. Betty confronted Dan repeatedly about Linda, expressing her concerns and suspicions about their relationship. Dan consistently dismissed her concerns as paranoia and irrational jealousy, insisting that Linda was simply a professional colleague and nothing more. But friends and family began noticing that Dan's attention and focus had shifted unmistakably toward Linda, and that he was spending far more time with his young assistant than seemed professionally necessary or appropriate. In February 1985, Dan Broderick moved out of the family home and filed for divorce. And what followed was 4 years of increasingly bitter and toxic legal warfare that would consume both parties and devastate their children. Betty firmly believed that Dan was deliberately using his superior legal expertise and his extensive connections within the San Diego legal community to manipulate the court system against her. Court records document an extraordinarily complex and contentious divorce, where Betty felt she was being systematically deprived of fair access to the substantial marital assets she believed she'd earned through her years of supporting Dan's education and career. Dan, meanwhile, accused Betty of being emotionally unstable, vindictive, and completely irrational, and he aggressively sought to limit her custody of their children and substantially reduce her share of his income and property. The situation spiraled rapidly into mutual destruction. Betty left dozens of profanity-laced voicemail, messages on Dan's answering machine, messages so vulgar and threatening that they were later played in open court during her murder trial. On one particularly volatile occasion, she drove her Chevrolet Suburban through the front door of Dan's new house, causing thousands of dollars in property damage. When Dan married Linda Kolkana in April 1989, Betty had their wedding cake delivered to Dan's law office with an obscene message attached. Dan responded by obtaining multiple restraining orders against Betty and having her arrested numerous times for contempt of court, for violating custody agreements and property division orders. He used his extensive legal knowledge to maximum strategic advantage, filing motion after motion that drained Betty's financial resources and limited her ability to fight back effectively. Their 4 children were caught directly in the middle of their parents' all-consuming warfare, forced to navigate the toxic situation while trying to maintain relationships with both parents. By November 1989, the divorce was finalized. Dan and Linda were living together as husband and wife in a beautiful home at 1041 Cypress Avenue in the Marston Hills neighborhood. Betty, meanwhile, felt that she'd been completely robbed of everything she'd worked for: her marriage, her intact family structure, her social standing in San Diego society, and what she considered a fair share of the wealth she believed she'd personally earned through her years of sacrifice. Friends later said she'd become utterly obsessed with the situation, unable to move forward with her life, consumed entirely by rage at what she perceived as profound injustice and betrayal by the man she'd devoted her entire adult life to supporting. For 1989, Betty Broderick drove to Dan and Linda's home in Marston Hills. She'd obtained a key to the house by taking it from her daughter's purse, where it had been kept for emergencies. She entered the quiet house around 5:30 a.m., while Dan and Linda slept peacefully in their bed. She walked through the dark house, made her way to their master bedroom, and stood at the foot of their bed. Then she raised a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver and opened fire. Dan Broderick was struck in the back and died almost instantly, the bullet severing his spine. Linda Kolkina woke from the gunfire and desperately attempted to reach the telephone on the nightstand to call for help, but Betty fired again, shooting Linda in the head and chest. Linda collapsed to the floor and died within moments. Betty fired 5 shots total in the bedroom, then calmly left the scene. She drove away from the house, stopped at a payphone to call her daughter and confess what she'd just done, then turned herself into police several hours later. The investigation was straightforward regarding who committed the murders. Betty had done so, never denied doing so, and there was no question about her guilt. The complex legal question would center on whether this was carefully premeditated first-degree murder or a crime of passion committed by someone who'd been pushed beyond her psychological limits. Betty's defense team argued passionately that she'd been systematically destroyed by Dan's deliberate manipulation of the divorce process, that she'd been deprived of fair treatment by a legal system that favored the wealthy male attorney, and that she'd finally snapped under unbearable psychological pressure after years of abuse. They presented expert witnesses who testified about her deteriorating mental state and argued she'd acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage rather than with calculated premeditation. The first trial, which began in October 1990, ended in a hung jury after 4 months of testimony. Some jurors believed Betty had genuinely been driven to temporary insanity by years of psychological and legal abuse. But prosecutors tried her again in a second trial, beginning in October 1991. This time they emphasized the calculated nature of her actions. She'd stolen a key to gain entry. She'd entered the home in the pre-dawn hours while Dan and Linda slept completely helpless in their bed, and she'd fired multiple shots at close range with clear intent to kill. They presented extensive testimony about her long-documented history of threats against Dan, her stalking behavior, and brought expert witnesses who testified that regardless of how difficult and unfair the divorce proceedings had been, cold-blooded murder could never be legally or morally justified. On December 11th, 1991, the jury found Betty Broderick guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. On February 7th, 1992, Judge Thomas Whelan sentenced her to 32 years to life in prison, with the sentences for each murder to run consecutively. Betty has been denied parole multiple times, most recently in January 2017. The parole board has consistently cited her continued lack of genuine remorse and her persistent tendency to blame Dan and Linda for their own deaths, arguing they provoked her beyond human endurance. She remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona and won't be eligible for another parole hearing until 2032, when she'll be 84 years old. The case became a massive cultural phenomenon, inspiring numerous books, television movies, and most recently a USA Network dramatic series. It sparked intense national debates about divorce law, gender dynamics in the legal system, and whether a woman of privilege could legitimately claim victimhood. Betty's 4 children, now adults, remain deeply divided. Some support their mother's eventual release, while others believe she should remain imprisoned for life. But if Betty Broderick's rage simmered over years before exploding into violence, another woman in New Jersey was about to demonstrate an entirely different kind of calculated cruelty, one that would require a saw, 3 matching suitcases, and the deep, cold waters of the Chesapeake Bay. Number 4. Melanie McGuire. In May 2004, fishermen pulling a dark green Kenneth Cole suitcase from the Chesapeake Bay uncovered the first clue in a murder that would become known nationwide as the suitcase killer. Inside were severed human legs, the first signs that fertility nurse Melanie McGuire had dismembered her husband and scattered his remains across the water in matching luggage. Melanie Lynn Slate was born October 8, 1972, in Ridgewood, New Jersey. Smart and ambitious, she studied statistics at Rutgers before switching paths to nursing. By 1999, she was working as a fertility nurse at Reproductive Medicine Associates, one of the most respected clinics in the country. That same year, she married U.S. Navy veteran and computer programmer William Bill McGuire. They lived in Woodbridge Township and had 2 sons. Outwardly, they were a typical middle-class New Jersey family. Behind the scenes, the marriage was deteriorating. Melanie later claimed Bill had become violent, angry, and financially irresponsible due to gambling. She also began a long-running affair with Dr. Bradley Miller, a physician at her clinic. Their relationship started in 2002 while she was pregnant with their second child and intensified over time. According to court records, Melanie worried a divorce would jeopardize her finances and custody of her children, concerns that prosecutors argued turned into motive. On April 28, 2004, Melanie and Bill closed on their first home. Just after signing, Bill excitedly called the gas company and two close friends. Those calls were the last time anyone heard his voice. Melanie claimed the couple had a violent argument that night, alleging Bill hit her, choked her with a dryer sheet, and threatened to take the kids. She told investigators he stormed out. The next morning, she contacted Dr. Miller to say Bill had left. Bill had not left voluntarily. Within a week, pieces of his body began surfacing. On May 5, 2004, fishermen near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel found a dark green suitcase containing a man's legs. 6 days later, a second larger suitcase washed ashore with a torso and head. Medical examiners found 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the chest and 1 to the head, all from a .38 handgun using wad cutter bullets. On May 16th, a third matching suitcase turned up, containing the arms. Virginia police released a facial reconstruction sketch. A friend immediately recognized it as Bill. New Jersey authorities took over the case. Investigators quickly uncovered troubling evidence. Search history on the McGuire home computer showed someone researching topics like undetectable poisons, instant poisons, how to commit murder, fatal insulin doses, and how to buy guns in NJ. These searches occurred between April 11th and April 26th. On April 26th, 2 days before Bill vanished, Melanie purchased a .38 handgun and wad cutter ammunition from a store in Easton, Pennsylvania. The receipt included a $9.95 item, and the store confirmed the only items at that price were boxes of wad cutters. On May 8th, Bill's car was found abandoned at the Flamingo Motel in Atlantic City. Surveillance footage showed it had been driven there early on April 30th. Melanie eventually admitted to moving the car herself, claiming it was a prank, despite simultaneously filing for a restraining order, claiming Bill was dangerous. Easy Pass data showed she had driven south into Delaware days after Bill's murder, contradicting her alibi. Inside Bill's car, police found a small bottle of chloral hydrate, a strong sedative. Pharmacy records showed a prescription for chloral hydrate had been called in on April 28th using Dr. Miller's prescription pad. Melanie had full access to those pads. When police searched the McGuire apartment, they found it unusually spotless, with fresh paint and thorough cleaning. But a detailed forensic sweep uncovered what prosecutors later called human sawdust, microscopic particles of Bill's flesh, and small hairs stuck to tape residue. In one suitcase, investigators found a hospital blanket labeled HCSC, the same type used at Melanie's clinic. On June 2, 2005, over a year after the murder, Melanie was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Additional charges included desecration of human remains, unlawful weapon possession, perjury, and hindering apprehension. She posted bail and awaited trial. Her trial began March 5, 2007. Prosecutors argued Melanie planned the murder in detail, drugging Bill with chloral hydrate, shooting him with the .38 she had purchased, dismembering his body, and disposing of the remains across the Chesapeake Bay. They presented the internet searches, weapon purchase, phone and toll records, the staged Atlantic City car drop-off, the forged prescription, and the blankets linking her to the suitcases. The defense countered that the case was circumstantial and that Bill could have been killed by someone tied to his gambling debts. They argued there was no blood evidence proving the murder occurred in the McGuire apartment and questioned whether Melanie had the physical strength to dismember a body, but the jury didn't buy it. On April 23, 2007, after weeks of testimony, Melanie McGuire was found guilty of first-degree murder, desecration of human remains, perjury, and weapons charges. On July 19, 2007, she was sentenced to life in prison. Under New Jersey law, she must serve at least 63 years before becoming eligible for parole, meaning she won't be considered until 2073, when she is 100. Melanie is incarcerated at Edna Mahan Correctional Facility under her maiden name, Melanie Slate. She continues to insist she was framed and that the real killer remains free. Her appeals have failed. She gave a lengthy 2020 interview in 2020 asserting her innocence. Bill's sister has custody of the couple's two sons. Melanie hasn't seen them since her conviction. Despite ongoing debate, including a podcast that questions whether she could physically dismember a body, most investigators and courts remain convinced she planned and carried out the murder. The case remains one of New Jersey's most infamous, cementing Melanie McGuire as the suitcase killer. Number 5. Pamela Smart. On May 1st, 1990, 24-year-old Greg Smart walked into his Derry, New Hampshire condominium and was ambushed by teenage boys who had been manipulated into believing they were killing for love. The mastermind was his own wife, 22-year-old Pamela Smart. Pamela Ann Wojdas was born August 16, 1967. Her family moved from Florida to Derry, New Hampshire in her youth. She was a cheerleader at Pinkerton Academy, popular and ambitious, later earning a communications degree from Florida State University. She met Greg Smart, her high school boyfriend in college. They married on May 7, 1989, and returned to New Hampshire to build their life. Greg joined his father's insurance business. Pamela became the media services coordinator at Winnicott High School. 7 months into the marriage, the relationship was already strained. Pamela's dreams of working in television hadn't materialized, and she was settling into a life she didn't want. At school, she volunteered with Project Self-Esteem, where she met 15-year-old sophomore Billy Flynn and another student, 17-year-old Cecilia Pierce. In February 1990, Pamela told Flynn she was attracted to him. He was young, impressionable, and vulnerable to an adult authority figure's attention. Their relationship became sexual by March. Pamela invited Flynn and Pierce to her condo one night while Greg was away, played the erotic film 9.5 Weeks, and initiated sex with Flynn upstairs. The affair was statutory rape, but it quickly escalated into something worse. Over the next several weeks, Pamela groomed Flynn psychologically and emotionally. She portrayed herself as trapped in an unhappy marriage, told Flynn she'd lose everything in a divorce, and repeatedly implied that the only way they could be together was if Greg wasn't in the picture. Flynn became emotionally dependent on her. When he hesitated, Pamela accused him of not loving her and threatened to end the relationship. Flynn told friends he would kill himself if she left him. By late April 1990, Flynn had recruited two friends, 17-year-old Patrick Randall and Vance Latham Jr., to help carry out a murder plan. Another teen, Raymond Fowler, agreed to assist. On May 1st, 1990, Pamela set up her alibi. She spent lunch at the library restaurant with coworkers, ensuring a dozen people could confirm she was nowhere near home. That morning, she had driven Flynn and his friends to Haverhill to borrow a car so her own vehicle wouldn't be connected to the crime scene. The boys ate pizza, discussed their plan, then broke into the Smart condo to wait for Greg. Around 10 p.m., Greg came home. Randall grabbed him, held a knife to his throat, and forced him to his knees. Flynn raised a .38 revolver and shot Greg once in the head. Flynn later testified he whispered, "God forgive me," before firing. The teens staged the apartment to look like a burglary and fled. When Pamela arrived home later that night, she screamed, banged on neighbors' doors, and played the grieving wife. Police noticed immediately that the scene didn't match a real burglary. Expensive electronics were stacked, but untouched, and the dog had been locked away. Investigators became suspicious. The investigation broke open on June 10, 1990, when another teen who overheard the conspirators talking came forward. Soon Flynn, Randall, and Latham confessed and implicated Pamela as the orchestrator. They described the sexual relationship, Pamela's manipulation, and her instructions on when and how to kill Greg. Most damaging was the involvement of Cecilia Pierce. Pierce suspected what Pamela had done and agreed to wear a wire. The recordings captured Pamela discussing the murder, worrying that the boys might talk and trying to control the story. On tape, she displayed chilling indifference. On August 1st, 1990, Detective Daniel Pelletier arrested her in the high school parking lot, telling her, "The good news is, we solved your husband's murder. The bad news is you're under arrest for it." Pamela was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and witness tampering. Her trial began in March 1991. and became one of the first trials in U.S. history televised gavel to gavel. It quickly turned into a media spectacle. The prosecution's case relied on the teenager's testimony and the wire recordings. Flynn testified Pamela told him she'd lose everything in a divorce and threatened to leave him if he didn't kill Greg. Jurors heard Pamela's own voice on tape discussing details of the plot. Her defense argued the teens lied for plea deals, but the recordings erased any doubt about her involvement. On March 22, 1991, the jury found Pamela guilty of accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy, and witness tampering. She received life in prison without parole, mandatory under New Hampshire law. Billy Flynn and Patrick Randall received 28 years to life sentences and were both released on June 4, 2015. Latham and Fowler were released in 2005. Pamela remains the only participant still in prison. Now incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, Pamela has spent more than 3 decades behind bars. She earned multiple degrees, tutored inmates, and became ordained as a minister. For 33 years, she maintained complete innocence, until June 2024, when she unexpectedly accepted responsibility for Greg's murder for the first time, admitting she deflected blame for decades because she couldn't face the truth. She is now seeking a sentence reduction, though no hearing has been granted. The case inspired the novel To Die For and the 1995 film starring Nicole Kidman, cementing it in American true crime history. Greg Smart's family continues to oppose any clemency, noting that even in her 2024 admission, Pamela never mentioned Greg by name. The Smart case remains one of the most infamous examples of manipulation, abuse of authority, and teenage coercion in American criminal history. Number 6. Denise Williams. When Mike Williams vanished during a duck hunting trip on Lake Seminole in December 2000, everyone assumed it was a tragic drowning. Authorities blamed alligators. The only person who refused to believe it was his mother, Cheryl, because Mike's widow, Denise, wasn't acting like a grieving wife at all. 17 years later, Cheryl's instincts were proven right. Denise Merrill grew up in a strict, church-focused Tallahassee community where divorce was frowned upon. She met Jerry Michael Mike Williams in high school. Both loved the outdoors, both were deeply rooted in the area, and they married in 1994. Mike became a successful real estate appraiser. Denise worked in accounting. Their daughter was born in 1999, and Mike's coworkers said he was devoted to his family. His father died in 2000, tightening family bonds even more. But behind the picture of a stable marriage, Denise had been having an affair since 1997 with one of Mike's closest friends, Brian Winchester. Brian and Mike had been inseparable since high school, and Brian and his wife Kathy frequently socialized with Mike and Denise. In 2000, Brian sold Mike a massive $1.75 million life insurance policy, extremely unusual for a 31-year-old with modest income. Mike never suspected his best friend and wife were plotting behind his back. According to Brian's later confession, the affair snowballed. Kathy suspected it in the late 1990s. By early 2000, Denise wanted to be with Brian permanently, but refused to divorce. Religious pressure, social stigma, and fear of sharing custody were stronger to her than morality. Brian didn't want to harm Kathy. Prosecutors later argued the two agreed the only path forward was killing Mike. They discussed multiple plans, including staging a boating accident, but never settled on one until Brian saved Mike from quicksand in Arkansas. That gave him an idea: stage a hunting accident at Lake Seminole, where drowning could look accidental. On December 16, 2000, Mike woke before dawn, excited for duck hunting and an anniversary getaway planned with Denise later that day. 2 days earlier, he'd told his family he and Denise hoped to have another child soon. He launched his boat and headed out, unaware that Brian had arranged to meet him. Brian later described planning every detail. He told Mike his phone battery was dead, so there'd be no call records. He encouraged Mike to put on heavy waders before stepping into the boat, knowing they would drag him down if he fell overboard. When they reached deeper water, Brian shoved Mike into the lake, expecting him to drown. Mike fought his way out of the waders and clung to a tree stump, screaming for help. Brian panicked, loaded a shotgun, circled the boat, and shot Mike in the face. Brian transported the body in his truck, established an alibi by returning home to bed with Kathy, then bought weights and a shovel at Walmart. He buried Mike in the muddy holes of Carr Lake, ironically the place he'd once rescued him from quicksand. He abandoned Mike's truck and trailer at the boat ramp, left the boat on the shore, and joined the search effort, playing the concerned friend. Search teams combed Lake Seminole for 56 days. They eventually found Mike's waders, jacket, and hunting license floating, suspiciously intact and appearing almost staged. But investigators accepted the theory that alligators consumed the body. Denise petitioned the court, and in July 2001, Mike was declared legally dead. She collected roughly $1.5 million in insurance, much of it from Brian's policies. Meanwhile, Cheryl Williams refused to believe the alligator story. She papered streets with flyers, contacted politicians, and begged authorities to reopen the case. Most people thought she couldn't accept Mike's drowning, but she was right. Mike had never drowned. In 2005, Denise married Brian Winchester, moving into the same home she'd shared with Mike. They lived together as husband and wife for years, raising their children while Mike's body lay buried in mud an hour away. By 2012, their relationship unraveled. Denise filed for divorce in 2015. On August 5, 2016, Brian kidnapped Denise at gunpoint, pulling her into her own car in what police believe was an attempt to stop her from turning on him. Denise escaped and reported the incident. Brian was arrested for kidnapping and assault. Investigators used the opening. Under pressure and facing decades in prison, Brian flipped. In 2017, he confessed to killing Mike Williams and agreed to testify against Denise in exchange for immunity from murder charges. He told detectives exactly where he buried the body. In December 2017, authorities recovered Mike's remains from Carr Lake. He had been shot in the head, still wearing his wedding ring. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams was indicted for first-degree murder, conspiracy to murder, and accessory after the fact. Her 2018 trial centered on Brian's testimony. He said the affair began in 1997, that they discussed murder scenarios repeatedly, and that Denise was the one who insisted divorce was not an option. Her job, he said, was to make sure Mike went hunting and to provide an alibi. Prosecutors argued Denise and Brian conspired for months and that she benefited financially and romantically from Mike's death. The defense called Brian a liar seeking revenge and a lesser sentence, claiming he killed Mike alone. They pointed out there was no direct physical evidence tying Denise to the planning. On December 14, 2018, Denise was convicted of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and accessory after the fact. She was sentenced to life plus 30 years. In 2021, her murder conviction was overturned due to insufficient evidence of direct involvement in the killing, but her conspiracy conviction stood. She now serves a 30-year sentence at Florida Women's Reception Center. She still claims Mike drowned. Brian Winchester is serving 20 years for kidnapping. He will never be charged with the murder because of his immunity deal. Cheryl Williams, who spent 17 years fighting to expose the truth, finally got answers, though justice was delayed nearly 2 decades. Number 7. Originally thought Stacey Castor was an unlucky widow who'd lost 2 husbands in 5 years. By the time the truth came out, they realized she was a calculated poisoner who'd murdered both men and then tried framing her own daughter to escape justice. Stacey Ruth Daniels was born July 24, 1967, in Clay, New York. She met her first husband, Michael Wallace, in 1984 when she was 17. They married in 1990 and had 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree. From the outside, they were a normal working-class family in the Syracuse area. Stacey worked for an ambulance company, giving her basic medical knowledge. On January 11, 2000, Michael died suddenly at age 38. Stacey told doctors he had heart issues and declined an autopsy. The death was ruled natural. She collected insurance money and raised their daughters alone. In 2005, she married again. Her second husband, 48-year-old businessman David Castor, appeared stable and devoted. But on August 22, 2005, Stacey called 911 claiming they'd argued. David had locked himself in their bedroom, and she feared he'd harmed himself. Police forced the door open and found David dead on the bed. A glass of green liquid sat on the nightstand. A jug of antifreeze was on the floor. No suicide note. Detectives immediately doubted the suicide theory. David owned firearms, so choosing antifreeze made no sense. Antifreeze poisoning is slow and agonizing. At the funeral, they noticed something disturbing. Stacey had buried David right next to her first husband, Michael. 2 dead husbands in 5 years, buried side by side, triggered a full investigation. Crime scene analysis turned everything. A turkey baster in the trash tested positive for antifreeze and David's DNA. The glass with the green liquid held only Stacey's fingerprints. Detectives concluded she drugged David, then force-fed him antifreeze while he was unconscious. Suspicious, investigators re-examined Michael Wallace's death. They learned that months before he died, he'd told his doctor he felt drunk without drinking, a classic antifreeze symptom. Stacey had told people he had several health issues, but his medical records showed otherwise. Detectives also realized both marriages had deteriorated shortly before each husband died. To them, antifreeze was Stacey's method of avoiding divorce and collecting insurance. They installed surveillance cameras at the cemetery where both men were buried. Stacey never visited once. In 2007, police obtained approval to exhume Michael Wallace's body. His organs were loaded with calcium oxalate crystals, the permanent byproduct of ethylene glycol poisoning. He hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd been poisoned exactly like David. Detectives confronted Ashley Wallace, now in college. They told her Michael had been murdered, not taken by natural causes. Ashley immediately called her mother. Stacey's phone was tapped, and investigators listened as she urged Ashley to come home and drink with her to relax. What followed was one of the most twisted acts in modern domestic crime. Stacey prepared cocktails for Ashley, first making her groggy, then mixing vodka, crushed pills, and other substances the next day. Ashley passed out. The following morning, her younger sister Bree found her unconscious with a long-typed suicide note beside her. The letter claimed Ashley had killed both Michael and David and wanted to die. Paramedics saved Ashley with minutes to spare. Detectives immediately noticed the letter repeatedly spelled antifreeze as anti-free, the exact pronunciation Stacey used during interviews. Computer forensics proved the note was typed on the family computer while Ashley was at school. Multiple drafts existed showing Stacey had written and rewritten the confession herself. Stacey was arrested on September 14, 2007. She was charged with murdering David, attempting to murder Ashley, and forging David's will. The trial began in 2009. Ashley testified first, telling jurors she never harmed anyone and woke up in the hospital confused, while detectives questioned her about a letter she didn't write. The evidence against Stacey was overwhelming. Her fingerprints were on the antifreeze glass. The turkey baster carried both antifreeze and David's DNA. The supposed suicide note was proven to be hers. Experts testified both men had identical antifreeze crystal patterns in their organs. Prosecutors argued Stacey murdered both husbands for financial gain, forged David's will to cut out his son, and when the investigation closed in on her, tried to kill Ashley and frame her for everything. Throughout trial, Stacey insanely insisted Ashley killed both men, even though she was 11 when Michael died. On February 5, 2009, Stacey was convicted of murdering David, attempting to murder Ashley, and forging the will. Judge Joseph Fahey told her she stood in a class all by herself compared to other killers he'd seen. She was sentenced to 51 years to life. Stacey continued denying everything until her death, telling reporters she had never harmed anyone. Her mother even blamed Ashley for the crimes, despite the evidence being ironclad. Ashley cut all contact. On June 11, 2016, Stacey died of a heart attack in prison at age 48. She was never formally charged with Michael Wallace's murder, but investigators had no doubt she'd killed him. The case became one of the most infamous antifreeze murder plots in U.S. history, cementing Stacey Castor as the Black Widow who poisoned 2 husbands and tried to sacrifice her own daughter to escape accountability. Number 8. Celeste Beard. When multi-millionaire Stephen Beard married a waitress more than 30 years younger than him, his family assumed she wanted money. Nobody expected the marriage to end with a shotgun blast, a mentally unstable lover pulling the trigger, and one of Texas's most notorious trials. Celeste Johnson was born February 13, 1963, and had a chaotic upbringing. She never knew her biological parents and met her birth mother only once, being told she was just an incubator. Celeste claimed abuse by her adoptive father and said she attempted suicide as a teen. At 17, she had twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer, with her first husband, Craig Bratcher. The marriage ended quickly. Craig later died by suicide in 1996. Celeste married twice more before meeting the man who would change everything. In 1993, while waitressing at the Austin Country Club, Celeste met 70-year-old retired Fox Broadcasting executive Stephen Beard. His wife of 42 years had died that October. Stephen was wealthy, lonely, and vulnerable. Celeste saw financial security. She divorced her third husband in 1994 and married Stephen on February 18, 1995. Stephen adopted her daughters and moved them into his Westlake Hills mansion. Celeste immediately embraced luxury. Their monthly budget was $35,000, but she routinely spent far more on jewelry, cars, and vacations. Within months, Stephen caught her taking his late wife's jewelry out of a safe deposit box. Furious, he briefly filed for divorce before reconciling. The marriage became a cycle of arguments and spending sprees. In early 1999, Celeste admitted herself to St. David's Pavilion Psychiatric Hospital. There she met bookstore manager Tracy Tarleton, who had bipolar disorder, depression, suicidal ideation, and a history of delusions. Tracy fell in love with Celeste and later testified they had a romantic relationship. Celeste encouraged her, giving her cards meant for Stephen and spending hours with her after they left the hospital. Stephen became suspicious after seeing Tracy attempt to kiss Celeste during a barbecue. He ordered her out of the house and banned further contact. Celeste ignored him. According to her daughters, Celeste drugged Stephen with crushed sleeping pills in his food and would then leave the house to see Tracy. The twins said their mother admitted she'd married Stephen for money and that he disgusted her. By mid-1999, prosecutors believed Celeste had decided murder was easier than divorce. On October 2, 1999, the morning before Stephen and Celeste were supposed to fly to Europe, Stephen was shot in the stomach while sleeping. It was around 3:30 a.m. Celeste claimed she was in a different wing of the mansion. Stephen survived long enough to call 911 himself, telling the operator, "My guts just jumped out of my stomach." Police found a 20-gauge shotgun shell near his bed. Stephen endured months of surgeries. Detectives tried questioning him in the ICU, but Celeste hired a defense lawyer and blocked access. When they finally reached him, Stephen became visibly upset at the mention of Tracy's name. Celeste then posted a notice blocking all further interviews. Meanwhile, investigators questioned the twins. Both immediately named Tracy as a potential shooter. Police found a shotgun in Tracy's home, and ballistic testing confirmed it was the weapon used. Tracy admitted the shooting, but refused to explain her motive. She did not implicate Celeste at first. On January 18, 2000, Stephen was released from the hospital. He was readmitted the next day with a severe infection linked directly to the gunshot wound. On January 22nd, he died from a blood clot. Tracy's charges were upgraded to murder. Celeste's behavior after Stephen's death was a red flag. Her daughter said she acted relieved, laughing frequently and spending aggressively. Celeste remarried within 6 months. Under Stephen's will, she inherited millions, including real estate, and at least $1 million in cash. In the months surrounding the shooting, she burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars. Tracy eventually realized Celeste had abandoned her. In jail, she saw a newspaper clipping about Celeste's new marriage and felt betrayed. In 2002, she entered a plea deal and gave a new statement. Celeste was the mastermind. Tracy now claims Celeste told her Stephen was abusive, convinced her they could only be together if Stephen died, and gave her instructions for the shooting. In exchange for testifying, Tracy received a 20-year sentence. Celeste was arrested on March 28, 2002, and charged with capital murder. Her 2003 trial drew massive media attention. Prosecutors argued Celeste married Stephen for money, manipulated Tracy emotionally, and used her to carry out the killing. They claimed Celeste had drugged Stephen at times, staged opportunities to sneak out, and set everything in motion to secure his fortune. Her lawyer, Dick DeGuerin, countered that Tracy was mentally unstable, delusional, and obsessed. He said Celeste rejected Tracy romantically, and that Tracy acted alone out of fantasy. Psychiatric experts for the defense testified Tracy had a pathological obsessive attachment to Celeste. The turning point came when Celeste's daughters testified for the prosecution. They described years of manipulation and their mother openly saying she married Stephen for money. The defense argued the daughters had a financial motive to lie, since they would inherit more if Celeste was convicted. The jury didn't buy it. On February 5, 2003, Celeste was found guilty of capital murder under Texas's law of parties and guilty of injury to an elderly person. She was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility in 2042. Tracy served 10 years and was released in 2011, expressing deep shame and regret. Celeste maintains complete innocence from prison, insisting she never had an affair with Tracy and that her daughters lied. Her daughters have never spoken to her again. The case inspired the first episode of Oxygen's Snapped and the Lifetime movie Secrets of a Gold Digger Killer. It remains one of Texas's most infamous cases of manipulation, obsession, and murder driven by money. Number 9. Mary Winkler, when church members found their minister shot dead in his bed on March 22, 2006, missing a Wednesday service for the first time. Nobody imagined his quiet wife had pulled the trigger, or that her sentence would ignite a national debate about abuse, self-defense, and gender bias. Mary Carol Freeman was born December 10, 1973, and raised in a strict Church of Christ family. She met Matthew Winkler through church, and they seemed perfectly matched, both religious, both focused on ministry. They married. Matthew became the pulpit minister at 4th Street Church of Christ in Selmer, Tennessee, and they had 3 daughters, Patricia in 1998, Mary Alice in 2000, and Brianna in 2005. To the town, they were the ideal Christian family living in the church parsonage. Matthew was popular with the congregation, described as joyful, dedicated, and deeply involved with his members. Churchgoers saw Mary as the model minister's wife, quiet, supportive, patient with her daughters, teaching Bible classes, and standing behind her husband's work. Outwardly, there were no signs of serious problems. Mary would later claim that behind closed doors, the marriage was abusive. She testified that Matthew was controlling, verbally abusive, and had hit her multiple times. Her sister said Mary stopped laughing after the wedding and appeared unhappy, and one recalled seeing bruises she was afraid to ask about. Mary said Matthew forced her to watch pornography, wear revealing outfits and wigs for sex, and submit to sexual acts that violated her beliefs. She described constant criticism and blame for anything that went wrong. At the same time, Mary had created a financial crisis she was hiding from him. She got involved in a fraudulent check scheme that put them thousands of dollars in debt. By March 2006, that fraud was about to be exposed, and she knew Matthew would find out. On the morning of March 22, 2006, around 6:15 a.m., Mary woke to the alarm in their bedroom. She later claimed she did not remember retrieving Matthew's 12-gauge shotgun from the closet, only standing near the bed, holding it and hearing a boom. The blast sent 77 pellets into Matthew's back as he slept, shattering his spine and damaging organs. He fell to the floor still alive, blood bubbling at his mouth. According to Mary, he managed to ask one word, why. She said she apologized, told him she loved him, wiped blood from his mouth, then left him dying on the floor. With her 3 daughters, aged 8, 6, and 1, still in the house, Mary gathered them into the family minivan and drove away from Selmer. She later said she wanted to give them one last carefree day before she was arrested. That evening, Matthew failed to show up for the Wednesday service, something he had never done. Church members noticed he had not picked up his mail and the girls had not been at school. Elders used a key to enter the parsonage and found Matthew's body on the bedroom floor, dead from a single shotgun wound to the back. The family van and all 3 children were gone. An Amber Alert went out. The next day, police in Orange Beach, Alabama stopped a gray minivan matching the description. Mary got out calmly, made no protest, and never asked why she was being detained. Her daughters were found safe inside. The shotgun was in the vehicle. When questioned about her husband, Mary gave the phrase that would follow her forever. "I guess that is when my ugly came out." She admitted shooting him, claimed the gun went off during an argument about money, and said she did not clearly remember getting it. Mary was charged with first-degree murder. The case exploded in the media. A minister's wife had shot her preacher husband in the back while he slept, then fled across state lines with their kids. She was indicted in June 2006, posted bond in August, and lived with family friends while awaiting trial. Trial began April 2007. When Mary testified, she painted a picture. of a 10-year marriage filled with fear and humiliation. She told the jury Matthew had hit her, yelled at her, criticized her constantly, forced her into degrading sexual situations, and blamed her for everything. She brought his wigs and shoes into court to show the jury what she said he made her wear. She insisted she grabbed the shotgun only to force him to talk, and that it discharged accidentally. A psychologist testified Mary suffered from depression and symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. Prosecutors said this was a lie. They argued she killed Matthew to avoid the fallout from her check fraud and to escape consequences. Matthew's family and church members took the stand to say he was a good husband and father, and that they had never seen signs of abuse. The state pointed to the shot to the back as he slept and argued it was clearly planned, not an accident. After 8 hours of deliberation on April 19, 2007, the jury rejected first-degree murder and found Mary guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Instead of a decades-long sentence, she faced a much shorter term. On June 8, 2007, she was given 210 days in jail and credit for about 5 months already served, with permission to spend up to 60 days in a mental health facility. In reality, she served only 67 more days locked up. The reaction was immediate and intense. Many people were outraged that a woman who admitted shooting her sleeping husband in the back served barely more than 2 months in prison. Critics argued that if a husband had shot his wife and then claimed abuse, he would never have seen such leniency. Supporters argued the jury had believed her abuse claims enough to reduce the charge, and that she posed little risk going forward. Mary was released in August 2007 and eventually regained custody of her daughters after a drawn-out legal fight with Matthew's parents, who had taken them in. She later moved within Tennessee, reported health problems, and tried to rebuild a quiet life. A TV movie based on the case angered her for reopening the story. To this day, the Winkler case divides opinion. Some see Mary as an abused wife pushed past her limit. Others see a woman who shot an unarmed sleeping husband and basically got away with murder. Her light sentence a product of sympathy and gender bias, rather than true self-defense. Number 10. Kelly Cochran. A Michigan woman and her husband made a twisted pact on their wedding night in 2002 that if either of them cheated, they would kill the lover together. It seemed like dark romantic fantasy, but 12 years later, that promise would become horrifyingly real, and investigators would begin to wonder if they were dealing with something far more sinister than a single crime of passion. Kelly Marie Cochran was born and raised in Merrillville, Indiana, not an hour's drive from Chicago. She and Jason Cochran grew up next door to each other, childhood friends who became high school sweethearts. They seemed genuinely enamored with each other, and after Kelly graduated from high school in 2002, they married young and started their own business servicing swimming pools. Friend Jennifer Ammerman later told investigators that Kelly was the conversation person in the relationship, outgoing, friendly, and social, while Jason was quieter and more reserved. They appeared to be an odd but devoted couple building a life together. But on their wedding night, according to Kelly's later statements to police, the newlyweds made a disturbing agreement. If either of them ever had an affair, it would be their responsibility to kill the person they cheated with, or one spouse would kill the other. Whether this pact was serious or just dark pillow talk would remain unclear for over a decade, but in 2014, those words would materialize into deadly action. Jason Cochran worked hard at their pool servicing business for 10 years, until his back gave out from physical labor, leaving him with chronic pain and unable to work. The medical bills mounted, debts piled up, and the couple's financial situation became desperate. In 2013, they left Indiana for Caspian, Michigan, a former mining community in Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula, looking for a fresh start in legal access to marijuana, which they hoped would ease Jason's chronic pain. Kelly found work at a factory that manufactured naval ship parts, and it was there she met Christopher Regan. Chris Regan was 53 years old, an Air Force veteran and Detroit native who worked at the same factory as Kelly. Despite their 20-year age difference, they bonded and became close. Reagan was involved with a girlfriend named Terry O'Donnell, but he and Kelly began an affair that grew increasingly serious. According to Kelly's later admissions, the relationship with Reagan was the only good thing I had in my life. On October 13, 2014, Kelly and Jason had a fierce argument about her affair with Chris Regan, and Jason demanded to know how she was going to fix things. The answer they arrived at, according to court documents, was murder, fulfilling the twisted pact they'd made 12 years earlier. On October 14th, 2014, Kelly Cochran invited Chris Regan to her home with the promise of sex. Regan came willingly, believing it would be a romantic evening with his lover. He had planned to reconcile with his girlfriend Terry O'Donnell that very day, but instead went to Kelly's house, completely unaware that Jason Cochran was hiding in the home, waiting with a .22 caliber rifle. As Chris and Kelly were having sex in the bedroom, Jason emerged from the shadows and shot Regan in the head at point-blank range, killing him instantly. What happened next demonstrated a level of cold calculation that shocked even experienced investigators. Kelly Cochran retrieved an electric handsaw, a sawzall, so Jason could dismember Regan's body. They methodically cut up the corpse, divided the remains between multiple garbage bags, and disposed of the pieces in remote wooded areas around Iron River in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. They cleaned the crime scene so thoroughly that FBI agents later couldn't find any DNA evidence on the walls, despite extensive forensic testing. When Terry O'Donnell reported Chris missing 10 days later, after he'd failed to show up for their planned reconciliation, Iron River police began investigating. They discovered Regan's car abandoned at a park-and-ride lot 4 miles east of Iron River, with a sticky note containing directions to the Cochran's home in Old Caspian. Iron River Police Chief Laura Frizzo and her tiny force of just 4 officers drove out to question Kelly and Jason Cochran. Sergeant Cindy Barrett later told investigators she found Kelly friendly, outgoing, not the least bit nervous, but that Jason was emotionless and stood off to the side. Kelly admitted to having an affair with Regan, but claimed she and her husband had an open marriage and that she hadn't seen Chris since around the time he disappeared. Jason, when questioned separately, appeared aggravated about his wife's infidelity, contradicting Kelly's claim of an open relationship. In March 2015, the FBI searched the Cochran's home with police. They found no body and no physical evidence linking the couple to Regan's disappearance. But they did discover something chilling: a rough draft of a book Jason had been writing that discussed going on killing sprees and seeking revenge against someone who closely resembled Chris Regan. Shortly after the search, the spooked couple packed up and fled Michigan, returning to their hometown of Hobart, Indiana. The case went cold for nearly 2 years. Chief Frizzo continued investigating even though the Cochrans were now out of her jurisdiction, focusing on a body of water near their former home called the Caspian Pit. Divers found a burn barrel with a clothesline and cement block attached to weigh it down, but there was nothing inside. Then on February 20th, 2016, Kelly Cochran called 911 from their Hobart home, hysterically reporting that her husband Jason wasn't breathing. When EMTs arrived, Kelly was disruptive and difficult to manage. Jason Cochran was pronounced dead at the hospital, initially appearing to have died from a heroin overdose. He'd been using heroin to battle his chronic back pain. But friend Walter Ammerman III immediately grew suspicious when he heard the news. Right away the wheels were turning, he told investigators. It just didn't seem normal. An autopsy revealed that Jason Cochran had actually died from asphyxiation, not heroin. The Lake County coroner determined Jason's death was a homicide, bringing the case to Detective Jeremy Ogden at the Hobart Police Department. The FBI contacted Ogden with an anonymous tip suggesting Jason's death might be connected to Chris Regan's disappearance in Michigan, and Ogden began what would become an intensive investigation spanning hundreds of hours. Ogden employed highly unusual psychological tactics to get Kelly to confess. He maintained a careful relationship with her, ensuring every interaction was non-custodial so she wouldn't lawyer up. He noticed Kelly frequently visited a specific park in Hobart and would sit by a particular tree. In a bold move, Ogden carved the words, "Chris is here," into that tree, hoping to make Kelly believe Regan was communicating from beyond the grave. The tactic worked. When Kelly saw the carving, she ran through the woods in panic, jumped in her truck, and drove away. That same night, she contacted Ogden and admitted for the first time that Chris Regan had been murdered. Initially, Kelly claimed Jason had shot Regan and forced her to remove the bullet from his skull and dismember his body. She painted herself as a victim, but investigators didn't believe her story. With Kelly, it was like, lie, 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 truth, lie, truth, lie, 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 truth. You gotta figure it out, Chief Frizzo told producers. Eventually, Kelly led investigators to a remote stretch of Michigan woods where they discovered Regan's remains, including a skull with a bullet hole, a .22 caliber bullet, parts of the rifle used in the shooting, and eyeglasses believed to belong to Regan. Kelly Cochran admitted to killing her husband Jason by intentionally injecting him with a fatal overdose of heroin, then smothering him to death to make sure he died. When asked why, she told investigators it was revenge, that Jason had taken away the only good thing in her life by killing Chris Regan, and she decided to even the score. She described the murders as fulfilling the pact they'd made on their wedding night. In 2017, Kelly Cochran went on trial for Chris Regan's murder. She pleaded not guilty and claimed Jason had abused her, even alleging he'd tied her up while killing Regan. The jury didn't believe her. On May 18, 2017, she was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to mutilate a dead body, concealing a death, larceny, and lying to police. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In April 2018, rather than face a second trial for Jason's murder, Kelly pleaded guilty to killing her husband and was sentenced to an additional 65 years in prison. But the story grew even darker while Kelly sat in jail awaiting trial. Court documents revealed she'd spent her time turning her eyeglasses into makeshift shanks, threatening violence and suicide. More disturbingly, she began making cryptic statements to investigators about other murders. Kelly's brother, Colton Gaboyan, told authorities he believed his sister had killed at least 9 people total, with bodies hidden in Michigan, Indiana, Tennessee, and Minnesota. Kelly hinted at having other friends buried in these locations and mentioned having a trophy bag or trinket bag with items from prior murders, though investigators never found such evidence. During her trial, prosecutors presented testimony about Kelly's serial killer claims, though key witnesses testified they never found proof the trinket bag existed. The court determined prosecutors were using these statements to show how Kelly was playing with authorities rather than proving she actually committed other murders. Perhaps most horrifying were allegations from Chris Regan's girlfriend and others that Kelly may have dismembered Regan's body, cooked portions of his remains, and served them to friends and family at a barbecue, claims Kelly has never directly addressed. As part of Kelly's plea deal in Jason's death, she was granted immunity from prosecution for any additional murders in Indiana if she provided locations of other victims. This meant she could confess to other killings without facing new charges in that state. To date, Kelly has not provided specific locations or identities of other alleged victims, and the mystery remains unsolved. Kelly Cochran is currently serving life without parole at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan. In a 2023 interview with ABC's 2020 from prison, she maintained she'd been trying to do what I thought was the right thing, going to school, getting married, but that she got bored from getting married. It was okay at the start, but all I did was work. Investigators who worked the case described Kelly as manipulative, cunning, and operating on a different level than typical criminals. Chief Frizzo, who spent years investigating the case, stated, "I'm so grateful that justice was served for Chris Regan, but I firmly believe that there are other victims out there." The Kelly Cochran case remains one of Michigan's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. Whether she's actually a serial killer responsible for 9 deaths as alleged, or whether her cryptic statements are just another form of manipulation, may never be known. What is certain is that a twisted marriage pact made on a wedding night in 2002 led to at least 2 confirmed brutal murders and left investigators wondering what other dark secrets might be buried in the woods of America's heartland.